Go. Shalom. Thank you for coming. Well, this is So welcome everyone on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I teach at UM, so I just came from my class at UM. The general age difference between that class to undergraduates and this is noticeable. You know, you have, yeah.
What do you teach?
Last semester I taught Jewish civilizations, and this semester I'm teaching a course called Torah and Ancient Law.
No.
Yeah. So, but today, what I wanted to talk about is a concept called post-denominationalism. So, a few years ago, I came up with an idea, which is that, here's what I used to do in the summer. To get ready for High Holy Day sermons, I would start, so, here, when I was in Fort Myers, and I was the only rabbi, I had to write like 5 or 6 of them. It was horrible. To come to a bigger synagogue is great because you only have to do 2. And then you can give it like 6 times because we have 400 services for everything. I gave it to the early service, the late service, the conservative service, the kids' service, the same sermon. So I only have to write 2. So what I would do is I'd say, okay, I'm going to write 1 in July and 1 in August. And I'll take a month. And it's pretty quiet here in the summer. And, you can block off 4 or 5 hours at a time on this day and on that day and on this day. And, I'd try to come up with a topic, and that was it. I spent about a month writing it and rewriting it, and sort of felt this is, it's like the most overrated thing in the world because I'm spending an inordinate amount of time that people will hear for 15 minutes and then walk out and say, it was okay. Yeah, I didn't really like it. It was fun, whatever. It was fine. But a few years ago, I came up with an idea of something I wanted to talk about, and I spent the whole year thinking about it. And, anytime I'd come up with an idea, I'd write it down on my phone in a note, and if I saw an article or something, or a text or a book, or that I wanted to, and I would really spend the whole year thinking about it. And then when I got to the summer, I would write it. And that's what I've done for maybe 4 or 5 years now. I've really just thought about an idea over the course of the year. And then in the summer, by the time I got to the summer and started writing, I felt that if I had to, I could just go up and just give it without any notes. Because I've been thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it for so long. So, look, then things happen. Then COVID happened, then October 7th, and things change. But there's an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I don't know that this is what I'm going to do for the High Holy Days because what I've tried to do the last couple years is between my one main sermon on Rosh Hashanah and my one main sermon on Yom Kippur. People tell me, oh, wow, we're the largest synagogue in the Southeast United States. People must say, wow, you get to influence so many people and talk to so many people. I say, yeah, twice a year. This isn't like one of those mega churches where every Sunday there's 15,000 people coming. This is one of those places where every Friday there's 8 people coming, and it's the same 8, right? So it's not. I don't have the power to influence tremendous amounts of people. So you only have a couple of shots a year. So I decided that one of my 2 sermons should be about what's going on in the world because it's important not to miss the moment, and the other one should be about something that could help people be better Jews and help our community here and what we're trying to do. And so 2 years ago I talked about coming to temple on Friday night, and this year I talked about our Beth Am University, and both of those programs are getting going, and it'll take a while, but we're making progress. But there was an idea that I had a few years ago that has become more and more crystallized in my mind, especially when we started to offer conservative services here. And when we start, so my background, just to give you some context of this, this may not be news to you, but just to give some context to where I'm coming from. I grew up in an Orthodox day school. My grandfather was a conservative rabbi, so we went to his temple, the conservative temple. And my parents, if you had to define it, even though we called ourselves conservative because we were members of a conservative temple, they weren't Shomer Shabbos, and they didn't keep kosher outside of the house. So this is my formulation now. A conservative Jew who doesn't keep kosher and doesn't keep Shabbat equals a Reformed Jew. That's pretty much, in terms of practice. Because the conservative movement endeavored to create a movement in this country that would have a cadre of Jews who kept kosher and kept Shabbat. Now, according to their standards, which means that, you could eat out in non-kosher restaurants, but you couldn't eat the chicken. You could eat the fish, you could have the salads, and so forth. And as we've started to have conservative services here, what I've noticed is that if you're someone who cares about being Jewish, and you're affiliated with a community, there are also secular people who are Jewish, don't care about anything. But if you're affiliated, if you care, and by the way, more than 60% of Jews in this country are affiliated with a synagogue. It's not like most Jews are out there doing nothing. In fact, and it's grown. It's closer to 70 now since October 7th. Are affiliated with either a synagogue or a federation or a JCC, but are involved with some sort of Jewish institution, mostly synagogue, which is really exciting. The main difference really today between Reform and conservative is prayer, is the liturgy. But other than that, it is not this is going to shock you to your core. It is not uncommon on Facebook to see a member of a conservative shul at Joe's with the crab. I have seen conservative Jews at Joe's. Now, are you raising your hand? Or? Please.
Very strong conservative population, and more Jews won Memphis in a barbecue contest with barbecue breakfast than anyone else. Conservative Jews.
Right. She from where she comes from, they've seen similar sort of eating treif. Now, eat whatever you want, do whatever you want, whatever. But that's not a conservative value, because originally you were supposed to stay within the strictures of what conservative Judaism said you're allowed to eat and not eat. Now, let me make this point. What's the difference with regard to Jewish law between Reform and conservative? The conservative movement says we're Orthodox. We follow halakha, we follow Jewish law, except where the movement says you don't have to. Where we've relaxed the rule or changed the rule because of this argument that our best scholars have come up with, which is a Talmudic argument. Fine. That's how I grew up. I grew up going to a seafood restaurant, but eating the flounder. Okay. Not the shrimp. I've never had shrimp in my life. I once ate bacon by accident. But I was eating a donut, and it had strips on it that I thought were chocolate. And then I really was salty. And I'm like, what a weird chocolate. What is that? And then, it wouldn't have even occurred to me. And then, I was like, it was horrible. Yeah.
Are you saying that the difference between a Reform and conservative Jew is food?
No, that's just one example. That's just one example. The difference between a Reform and conservative Jew, if you follow the movement, is that in the conservative movement, you have to follow Jewish law unless the movement has said you don't. So, for example, you're not allowed to use electricity on Shabbat. But the conservative movement said, better to use electricity and drive to services than not be able to get to services at all. Whereas an Orthodox Jew would say, better to stay home than violate Shabbat by getting in the car. Now, the Reform movement said, that's not how we see it. The Reform Jew is autonomous to decide which mitzvahs speak to you and you want to do and which ones you don't. But I would submit today that a very high percentage of Reform and conservative Jews, or people who are members of Reform and conservative synagogues, and this is going back a long time already, consider themselves autonomous. Wake up in the morning and say, am I going to daven shacharit today? Am I going to put on tefillin today? Nah. Why? My decision. And I decide, no. Okay? Now, so this has been for a long, long time. I mean, I grew up in a conservative movement, and after shul, and we went to synagogue pretty much every Saturday, and after shul, most of the guys would go play golf. Okay, fine. That's just as, but what stayed was that conservative Jews didn't really feel comfortable in Reform services for a variety of reasons. One, there was a lot of English. Two, the music was a lot different. Three, it was much less traditional. And four, some of the ideas had been changed. Some of the parts of Jewish liturgy that the Reform movement found objectionable were taken out. And so honestly, I grew up this way. I grew up, whenever I would go to a Reform synagogue, the only time I ever would be if one of my friends was having a bar bat mitzvah there. So we go to the bar bat mitzvah there, and I remember they said at the synagogue, the Reform synagogue in the town that I grew up in, they used to do like something from Fiddler on the Roof. And it was like a Shabbat song. I forget which one it was. In any event, my parents would just be like, what is this? This is like a Broadway show, you know what? If only then, as a 9 or 10-year-old, I could have said to them, yeah, but that's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my career, so let's not denigrate it too much. That's my future. But it was just so different than what we were used to, that and it didn't feel Jewish, whatever that means. That we didn't quite get it. So let's go now to the beginning. The rest of the world, from the time that the Holy Temple was destroyed in 70 CE through the 1700s and into the early 1800s, there was no such thing in Chag Sameach, Happy Pesach. Yeah, all right. He's eating matzah. By the way, I went to a comedian on New Year's Day in Boca with my parents. His name is Ilan Gold. Have you ever heard of him? Very funny. So, it's for Ilan Gold, who grew up Orthodox, to perform in Boca. I mean, it's a hometown. It's a comfortable crowd. So, in the middle of the show, this older guy in a kippah gets up and walks out. And the comedian says, "Well, you going to do mincha?" And the guy goes, "Yeah." He was. He's going to do it. It was great. I want to bring him here. He's very funny. He did the best Donald Trump impersonation I ever heard. He said, he's talking about getting shot in the ear, and he's like, getting shot. I was great. I did great. I'm so good. Better than Lincoln. Better than Kennedy. You got to dodge. They didn't dodge. I dodged. was very funny. And he's got a whole thing on why Jews don't have Christmas trees, because if you had a Christmas tree, you've got to shecht it, and, it might not be kosher, and what if it has forget it. That's more of a halachic joke, but he's a very funny guy. Okay, so the rest of the world, there was no such thing as movements. If you were Jewish, all there was Judaism. Now, over time, there were different types of Orthodox Judaism, but it wasn't called Orthodox Judaism because there was no such thing as Reform and Conservative. There was just Orthodox. Eventually, you had the difference between the Hasidic Jews and the Jews who opposed the Hasidic movement, who were called the Mitnagdim, or the Misnagdim. But after a while, even they got together. And after a while, even they started to get along. And there was just Orthodox Judaism. There was no, your Judaism isn't Jewish enough. There was just Judaism. Until the 1800s. In the the late 1700s, early 1800s, mainly in France and Germany, you have a new way of looking at the Bible, not just in the Jewish world, but in the Christian world. And when the Christians this was the Enlightenment period, when the Christians in France and Germany started to look at the Bible and say, wait a minute, how do we know this really happened? And we have archaeology now. Yeah. And we have literary analysis now. And, we know more things now. Maybe this didn't happen the way. So some Jews started to say, whoa, we can look at the Bible from a liberal perspective? And this was a new discipline that came into the world called Wissenschaft des Judentums. Anyone here speak German? I don't either. So Wissenschaft des Judentums means the scientific study of Judaism. And once they started to do that and said, well, you know what? Maybe this isn't exactly how it happened. And maybe we don't have to be so strict with the laws. That was the breaking point. But there was combine that idea with one other idea. After the French Revolution, when people started saying all men are equal, the French, they messed up. Because after their revolution, they said, equality, whatever, truth, equality, freedom, whatever. They said everyone's free, and then they say, oh, wait, darn it, we didn't mean the Jews. But we messed up. But there was an emancipation. Now, how many of you have heard this before? In Germany, the Jews, before Hitler came, considered themselves first German and then Jewish, and they were the most patriotic Germans there were. You've heard that before, right? Yes. Why? Why didn't the Hungarians love being Hungarian? And why didn't the Romanians love being Jews, being Romanian? What was it about Germany that the Jews loved being in Germany?
It was a very successful society, and before the First World War, preeminent in so much. Science, universities were world-renowned. It was in some ways a world leader.
And
there's a lot to be proud about in Germany in 1914.
But yes, and one other thing. In those wonderful universities and in those wonderful sciences and in those wonderful culture and music and art and so forth, the Jews were allowed in. Do you know that what happened when the Nazis came is they said, all the Jewish professors are no longer allowed to teach. So there were Jewish professors? How many Jewish professors do you think were, running around Moscow? Or these other, anti-Semitic places. The German Jews were on their way towards being accepted. If you go to the Berlin Jewish Cemetery, which is one of the largest cemeteries in Europe, there are thousands and thousands of Jews who died in World War I fighting for Germany. It's mind-boggling. I was there to see how many It's a very interesting place. A lot of Jews, by the way, when Nazis came to power, they hid out in the cemetery. And so there's like hiding places and stuff. It's really an amazing place to visit. A lot of famous rabbis buried there too. Leo Beck is buried there. So those Jews who came to America, who saw themselves from Germany and from France, and sort of from the central to western parts of Europe, when they came to America, and they were, in their mind, they saw themselves as German first and Jewish second. When they came here, all they wanted to do was fit in here. And all they wanted to do was assimilate. And they were already used to an idea of a reform culture here in America. And so the reform movement fit them. And the rabbis who were leading the reform movement were mainly German. On the other hand, who else was coming? Between 1880 and 1920, 2 million Jews came to America. Before 1880, there were only 50,000 Jews in America. Half of them were in, Charleston. And a lot of them were Sephardic. They had come from, Brazil, other places where the Inquisition came in Latin America, and they ended up, in Jamaica or wherever, and they were traders, and they ended up in places like Savannah and Charleston and Nashville and New Orleans and stuff like that. The real birth of the Jewish community, though, in America was between 1880 and 1920. Why? Because in 1882, Alexander II was assassinated, and his son, Nicholas, blamed the anarchists who killed him as a Jewish movement. It wasn't. There might have been one guy in the anarchy group that helped assassinate Alexander II, but Alexander II was actually very friendly to the Jews. The Jews liked Alexander II. He eased up on some of the restrictions. But Nicholas blamed the Jews for his death. And what did this do? This ushered in the era of the pogroms. And that's when the anti-Semitism, as horrible as it already was, took on a very violent turn. And for the first time ever, there was a place where you could go, the United States. And so between 1880 and 1920, all of those Jews who were escaping the pogroms came to America. You know what they had in common with the German Jews? Nothing. Nothing. And they came in, and they went into a Reform shul, and they heard Fiddler on the Roof, and they said, what is this Goyish nonsense? Right? It didn't work for them, because they were much more traditional. They were not, oh, we're so thrilled to be Ukrainian. They hated Ukraine. Ukraine was the most anti-Semitic place in the world. They weren't excited. They didn't go into the Russian army because they liked it. They were forced and drafted into the Russian army in order to get them to stop being Jewish, as opposed to the German Jews who couldn't wait to go volunteer for Germany because they loved Germany. So now you have in this country two different types of people. More modern, assimilated type Jews who just want to come here and fit in and do well. And another type of Jews who are so sick of being persecuted that they just want to go somewhere and fit in, but their Judaism is much more traditional. And they don't have this Enlightenment stuff. And they don't have Wissenschaftes Judentum. And they don't have literary analysis. And they don't care about the archaeology. And they still have their tefillin. And they still have their mezuzahs. But they know that being Orthodox and being different and eating different hasn't worked. And they come to America and they want to make a living. And what can they do? So they have these jobs that are mainly in stores. And at the time, America's weekend was just Sunday. Saturday was a regular work day. And so these Hungarian Jews and Lithuanian Jews would come out and they'd take a job at a store and they said, I can't work on Saturday. And the shop owner would say, it's our busiest day. What are you, crazy? Say, Shabbos. What? And there became a phrase in America that was famous. If you don't come in on Saturday, don't come in on Monday. So Sunday they're closed. Sunday they go to church, whatever. play golf, whatever they do. Clams, whatever. But if you don't come Saturday, you don't have a job on Monday. Also, you're a Romanian Jew or whatever, you live in Philadelphia, you go to the supermarket, for $1 you can get a chicken, or you go to the kosher supermarket, and for $12 you can get a kosher chicken. It's way more expensive, harder to get, harder to deal with. Still today it is too. So what you see is these Jews who are coming from Hungary, anywhere in Eastern Central Europe, they're coming to America. They see that if they're going to try to stay as traditional and Orthodox as they were over there in Europe, here, they're not going to be able to make a living. They're not going to be able to afford to eat. They're not going to fit in, and they're going to have the same anti-Semitism here that they had over there that they're trying to get away from. But at the same time, they said, well, so Orthodoxy doesn't look like, I'm not paying $400 for a chicken. I need to work on Saturday, but they're playing fiddler on the roof. So the Reform, that's crazy. Orthodox not working. I need something in the middle. Conservative Judaism. And what you started to see, in Cincinnati, when I was in rabbinic school there were 2 Jewish golf clubs. Cincinnati is an old Jewish community. It's withering too. It's not much left of what, but in its heyday, it was really something. And it was the home of Reform Judaism. It's where Why Cincinnati? Because Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism, had his first job in Albany. New York, and then New York City, and then Albany. And then he got a job in Cincinnati. But at his last job, he was too reform. His reforms were too... There was no reform movement yet. There were just these synagogues that weren't Orthodox. And there was no movement yet. So Isaac Mayer Wise, who founded the Reform movement in America, he said, okay, in our synagogue, here's what we're going to do. We're going to, we're going to have this reform, and we're going to have that reform. Like, we're going to have an organ, and we're going to use, different things. Men and women will sit together. And on Rosh Hashanah, he got in a fight with the president of the temple about his reforms. I forget exactly which ones it was. During Rosh Hashanah, on the bima, during the service, Isaac Mayer Wise punched out the president of the temple. Had he not done that, I never would have met my wife. Because he got fired. You can imagine. And got a new job in Cincinnati. That's where he came up with the idea we need a rabbinic school. That's how I ended up in school in Cincinnati. My wife's from upstate Ohio. She moved to Cincinnati. Had he not punched that guy, I never would have met my wife. So,
I always thought it was interesting because I grew up thinking that it's done from Orthodox to conservative to Reform. And then when I learned that Reform had been created before conservative reaction to that.
correct.
I was curious when all that happened. Was there a lot of animosity between the groups? Was there a lot of competition or animosity in the beginning?
No, not really. Do you all know about the Treifa banquet? How many of you have heard of the Treifa banquet? Okay, so I'll explain it in a second. So far, let's just recap so far. Between 1880 and 1920, as mass amounts of Jews are coming from Europe to the United States and America's Jewish community is starting to become formidable, we have two different types of Jews. By the way, this is why I brought up Cincinnati. So in Cincinnati, there's 2 Jewish golf clubs. Although they've now, ironically, and I think this is maybe a microcosm of everything I'm talking about, they've merged. Now, there was one called Crest Hills and there's one called La Santaville. La Santaville opened first because the German Jews who first came to Cincinnati could not get into the non-Jewish golf clubs. They didn't take Jews. Crest Hills emerged because La Santaville wouldn't take the Eastern European Jews. So This is unbelievable. I mean, you can't make it up. So one was where all the conservative Jews played, because they were the Eastern and Central Europeans. We're talking going back 100 years. And the other one was where the German Jews played, and they all went to the Reform schools, which is just unbelievable. Neither of them allowed Reform rabbinic students to play for free, which I thought was a shanda. I said, come on, we're here for 4 years. Let us play. Hardly any of us play anyway. But whatever. I ended up getting to play there once in a while. Okay. So now, to go back to Pamela's question for a second. It is true that the Reform movement emerged first in the United States. In 1883, they had their first ordination. Aaron knows all about it. Why? How are you related to David Phillips?
Great uncle. My grandfather's brother.
There were 4 graduates of the first class of the Hebrew Union College, and Aaron's relative was one of them. Very famous rabbi, Rabbi David Phillips. And I mean, you look at Aaron, you say, how's his, what's his Torah, what's his Torah? Otherwise, premeditatively designed the menu. But when they had the ordination, it wasn't so much the Reform movement. By the way, what Isaac Mayer Wise wanted to do, he wrote a prayer book. You know how to say custom in Hebrew? Minhag. Minhag. Minhag means custom, but it can also mean like the rite, R-I-T-E. His prayer book was called Minhag America, the prayerful rite of America. His goal was to create a movement that would be for all American Judaism. That there wouldn't be Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative, that there would just be one movement. Now, right away, the Orthodox said, forget it. Forget it. But there was no conservative yet. They invited all the major Jewish leaders in the United States. I mean, this is something that can never happen today. I mean, actually, that's not true. Reform and Orthodox and Conservative, we sit together in America. In Israel, it would never happen. In Israel, the Orthodox rabbis won't sit with us. But in America, we're starting to. So they invited all the main leaders, and on the menu was clams, milk and meat served together, shrimp. So some of the people said, we're interested in not being Orthodox, but this is ridiculous. And they walked out. And this became known as the very famous Treifa banquet. Right? It's also the name of from rabbinic school, my fantasy football league. That's the name of the league, of the students. I'm still in the same fantasy football league with my friends from rabbinic school. Okay. This led to a different type of movement founded by some very famous thinkers that I'm sure you've heard of, most especially Solomon Schechter and Zacharias Frankel. And they came up with an idea that you had to stick to Jewish law, whereas the Reform were jettisoning Jewish law and saying that we're not impressed by it, it no longer interests us. The Conservatives said, what are you talking about? You're either Jewish or you're not. You have to follow the law. However, there are things that we have learned over time that allow us to change Jewish law. Now, Orthodox Jews say there's no such thing as that. Everything we ever learned about Jewish law was taught to Moses at Mount Sinai, and you can't change it. And even though we make innovations to protect those laws, the laws are the laws, and there's nothing to change. But the conservative movement, so I'll give you an example. This is a more recent example. But I don't remember how many years ago, maybe 10, I don't remember how many years ago, but the conservative movement started accepting homosexual students into the rabbinic school, where previously they didn't. By the way, the Reform movement previously didn't accept them either, but now they started. So they said, well, how can you do that? It says very clearly in the Torah that this is impermissible, or that this way of life is not approved of. So what they said is, yes, but at the time that the Torah was written, if we knew now what we knew then, if we knew that it wasn't aberrant behavior, that it's actually in your genes and in your chromosomes, and that's just how you are. We would have said so then, but we didn't know. But because we've learned about so we've changed our view. Fine. By the way, Orthodoxy has a very interesting view on this. Orthodoxy does not believe, in Christianity, in certain sects, sects, they say it's a challenge that God has given you for whatever reason, and you're not allowed to act on it. Now, Reform movement rejects that. Conservative movement has now rejected that. But that's the Orthodox view. But my point is that the conservative movement has said, we've learned things that since Mount Sinai that inform our interpretation of Jewish law. Also, they say, things have changed. Yeah, it was fine that everyone should have to walk to shul when there's a shul on every corner. But now, if I walk outside my house, I'm going to get hit, I'm probably going to get shot. I might get hit by a car. God knows what's happening out there. It's 12 miles away. There's no way I would ever get to shul on Shabbat. I can't afford to live by the shul. I'm driving to shul. And the conservative movement said, better that we should fulfill the mitzvah of having a minyan than, not doing that because people can't drive. Now, the Orthodox view is different. The Orthodox view is tough. You got to live by the shul. And if you can't, better than you stay home. Okay, so it's a difference of opinion, but both took the law very serious. The Reform Jew says, I can live wherever I want because who cares? I never go to temple anyway. That's a joke. It's a joke. All right. Now, these were the decisions and the factors that created American Judaism in terms of our denominations. And so it became that if you were a Jew in America, you were either Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox. And the overwhelming majority of Jews in America, really up through the 60s and 70s, was Conservative. Conservative was the largest. Now, there's a principle in Jewish law that says you always go by the majority. Now, what I'm going to tell you now is amazing. You always go by the majority. That's a very commonly understood principle of Talmudic law. If one rabbi says one thing, by the way, whenever you're studying Talmud, it always says, the rabbis say blah, 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 but Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not how you do it. Okay. So who do you go? You always go with the rabbis. So why do they even tell you Rabbi Yehuda? Because in Judaism, we always consider the minority opinion because we want to make sure we look at it from every angle. But you always go with the majority. So the conservative movement said, hey, we're the majority. We're the largest movement in America who takes seriously Jewish law, and we say this, so that's how it should be. So if that's your opinion, what do you do the day that the Reform becomes larger than you? You messed up, if that was what you did. Right? You put your foot in your mouth. So you could say, oh, well, they don't take Jewish law seriously, so we're still whatever. Now, what I'm pointing out is that our traditional understandings of what your identity is as a Jew is very much related to how the Jewish community in America was born between 1880 and 1920. So, for example, if you ask someone, well, what are you? They say, I'm conservative. You don't say, oh, does that mean you keep kosher? Oh, does that mean you keep Shabbos? Oh, does that mean you daven 3 times a day? Does that mean you go to the mikveh? It means one thing. The shul that I go to is conservative. And because of that, I'm conservative. And that's how it was. Maybe you are a conservative Jew who does all those things. But I can tell you, when I was growing up, we were the most conservative Jewish family in town. My grandfather was the rabbi there for 35 years. My mom didn't go to the mikveh. We didn't daven 3 times a day and put on tefillin. Well, actually, I did when I was in school, because I went to an Orthodox school. And if you didn't put on tefillin, the rabbi would come and hit you with a hanger. It was a little different than what we have over here. But, my parents didn't we drove on Shabbos. We went to temple a lot because my grandfather would yell at my dad if we didn't. But, we were pretty much living a Reform lifestyle. And so was everyone else that went to our shul. But we were conservative. And the people who went to Reform, ugh. And the people who went to Orthodox, they're crazy. Yeah. So, you're conservative, you got crazy lunatics to the right, you got goyim to the left, and this is the majority. Right? That's how I grew up.
Rabbi, at what point did, in my lifetime, did Reform Judaism change? When I was a kid, they did the yarmulkes here, the tallis here. At some point, all the traditions
Yeah.
you put back and you could take out what you know about it.
Okay, perfect segue. So now, where you really are is the mid-'70s. Two things happened in the '70s that changed everything. But what I'm saying so far, though, is that the conservative movement through the '60s was, and really into the '70s and '80s, conservative movement was the dominant movement, although the Reform movement was gaining a lot of strength, and in some ways, through Chabad, through Yeshiva University, Orthodox Judaism also making very serious headway. And today they continue to they're really blossoming. In 1972, the Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary, ordained its first woman. And in 1975, the year that I was born, the Reform movement came out with a new prayer book called The Gates of Prayer, or as one of my professors in rabbinic school called it, GOP. Because G-O-P. Gates of Prayer, the prayer book before Gates of Prayer in the Reform movement was called the Union Prayer Book. The Union Prayer Book was almost entirely in English. Almost entirely. There were only a couple Hebrew words in there. It referred to the rabbi as reverend. It was what you called classical reform. It was so far, it was almost impossible to distinguish it from a church service. In 1975, when Gates of Prayer came out, it was entirely in Hebrew and English. Every prayer, you had the full prayers in Hebrew, and you had a lot more tradition put back in. And this was the change. When rabbinic students started to learn more and more Hebrew and become more and more versed in Jewish tradition, because there was a real period of minimalism at the rabbinic schools where Reform rabbis weren't. If you were a Reform rabbi in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you could unless you came from an Orthodox family, you could probably barely read Hebrew. There were many, many, many Reform rabbis who, when they opened up the Torah, you could see writing in the Torah, because they didn't know enough Hebrew to be able to find their place for the different holidays. So they would actually write in the Torah, which is a shanda. It's a terrible sin to do that. But this is what they did. And you see, actually, in Reform synagogues, a lot of synagogues, sometimes you'll see writing in it, and it's not kosher. It's a disgrace, but I've seen that before.
I have a little vignette. I came to Beth Am in '76 and started teaching Hebrew. And so I had Aleph, Kita Aleph, first grade. And I show a picture of the mother and say, who is this? And the Ima, and so on. And so one time I showed a picture of the kippah. And he said, what is it? And he said, optional.
Optionals, yeah. Right. Because there used to be there was a sign by the yarmulke basket that said optionals. So,
I was just struck by what you said about looking at the Talmud, taking it literally as opposed to, well, we know more about science now, and times have changed and glories have changed. This is the same argument you get with the literal construction of the Constitution.
yeah,
It's remarkably similar.
yeah. For sure,
I'm just struck by that.
the class that I'm teaching for at UM this semester, Torah and Ancient Law, you have to be in the religious studies department often to take these classes because they only allow 16 students in. The only other way you can take the class is if you're pre-law. Seriously. So there's,
I'm a lawyer, so it just,
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
yeah, I mean, my brother's a lawyer. He told me when he was in law school, they had, Talmudic ideas that as part of one of his courses. It was really, really interesting. Pamela?
Because we're conservative also, we're sure. And I'm just happy to choose the Reform Jewish group. That was really enforcing summer camps and all that. But it was really interesting. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you was, there seems to be competition, I said conflict earlier, but maybe I meant competition amongst the different sects.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've seen so many other sects come up, and
Yeah.
Orthodox and Reform sects.
Mm-hmm.
The humanist and constructionist and red and everything small, but there's all kinds of things like that. And wondering, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud that I guess there's always going to be people who are going to try and break from
Sure.
the fold and create their own thing.
Yeah.
With some degree of success or not.
So, yeah. So I want to touch on that, but let me sort of finish the view from what I was saying to Miller. When in the 70s, the Reform movement came out with a new prayer book, it was a symbol that we were ready to start taking back and reappropriating things from Jewish tradition. Start to wear taluses and yarmulkes, and not so much tefillin, but to take the Judaism more seriously. And the reason why was, and the reason why Reform in the beginning wanted to make such a break and be so radical, was because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Orthodox. Because there was nothing else. They really wanted to fit in America. This is a way to fit in. But after a while, after several decades, it became so clear that we're not Orthodox. We've now established ourselves as a movement. They said, why not take back some more of this? So, Rabbi Baumgart and I, we didn't agree. We would not have agreed philosophically on probably anything. I had some chances to get to know him. I presided over his funeral, and we had some conversations once in a while when he was here. And we talked about it, and it was fascinating. And while we probably wouldn't have agreed on anything philosophically, if it wasn't for him and his generation, I could never be who I am. My generation of Reform rabbis who wear kippot and keep kosher could never have broken away from the Orthodox without his generation making a space for us to do it and not be Orthodox. So they paved the way for who my generation is today, which I think is interesting. And we used to talk about that. Okay, so now what you're starting to see is two factors. As the Reform movement starts to become a little bit more traditional, we start to give the conservatives a little bit more of a run for their money, because we're not as goyisha in the eyes of a lot of Jews. But at the same time, we enter the era of intermarriage. And here's another formula. Conservative Jew marries a non-Jew equals a couple in the Reform congregation. Let's do it one more time. You have a conservative Jew who marries someone who's not Jewish, becomes a Reform couple. Why? Because he marries a non-Jew. He goes to his rabbi, who's been his rabbi since his bar mitzvah. Can you please marry me? No. Get out. Shul down the street. Rabbi, will you marry us? No problem. Come on in. Here's your dues form. Welcome to, Temple Rodef Kesef. You got it? All right. Rodef Kesef. It's a joke. So there's a common name for a synagogue is Rodef Shalom. Rodef means pursuing shalom, pursuing peace. This temple Rodef Kesef. pursuing money. All right, President. So, these are the kind of jokes my professors used to make. Yes.
Reading the Torah, we have Torah classes, all the Jews, when they first started, married sixes. For a certain extent, there was no Jews.
Well,
You look back at this and you say,
yes and no.
well, they were taught.
Right. Yes and no. So back then, the laws were different because the Torah hadn't been given yet. But there were two kinds of people in the world: monotheists and polytheists. You can marry anyone you want, so long as they believe in one God. But if they worship idols, you can't. And that's it. So, when Abraham sends Eliezer to go find Rebekah, yeah, she's from a family of idol worshippers. But do this test with the camels to see. So you could only marry someone who believed in one God. Same thing with Moses. Moses, this is this week's Torah portion. Moses goes out to Midian. He finds Zipporah. Zipporah is the daughter of Jethro, who's a priest of idolatry. She converted. What does converted mean? She joined a shul? No. She joined the sisterhood. See, you could do this. You could do this. She believed in one God. And you see evidence of that as we go. Okay, now I'm combining a whole coursework of information into an hour and 15 minutes because there's a lot more issues I want to get to. But let me try to sum it up and tell you what I'm thinking. But before I do that, there's one more issue that has played a major role, and I just want to tell you this issue by way of a story. Several months after October 7th, I went to Israel on a volunteer mission with JNF. And one day I'm sitting we had a break. We're sitting in a field. I'm sitting by this Jewish guy from Detroit. And he says to me, I tell him I'm a rabbi. We start talking. He said, "What kind of rabbi are you?" I said, "A good one." He said, "No." No, I said, Reform, but we have a conservative minion. And he says, "Really, you're Reform?" "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'm surprised you're here." "Why?" He says, "Because where I live, the Reform rabbis, they're not so pro-Israel." And so he says, my problem with Reform and conservative is the difference in politics. I'm like, what are you talking about? Now, I'm from Miami, where everyone's a Zionist. But there are other cities where there are rabbis who aren't as pro-Israel, or at least pro-Israel in the way that maybe we think of. So he says, in my shul, he went to a Reform synagogue. He said, "In my shul, my rabbis would never talk the way you do. Our big donors do lots of business with Arabs because they live in Detroit, and they can't say things like Israel like you do. And so one of the issues that has divided movements is stance on Israel. Now, I don't think that this means that Reform Jews and conservative Jews have different views on Israel. But I do think that Reform rabbis and conservative rabbis have different views on Israel. And that tends to dictate how the movements go. And to my great sorrow, I think there are a lot of Reform rabbis who aren't nearly as pro-Israel as our conservative colleagues, which I think is a disgrace. And I'm certainly not one of them. But that Zionism and our approach to Israel these days has become a factor. So let me just sum this all up. Hang on. Okay, go ahead.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
In Israel,
Yeah.
because you're talking about the Jews in America, in Israel, as I see it, it's just the Orthodox and the secular.
Yeah. So Reform, there is Reform and conservative in Israel. I don't know if it's working. I don't think it's that great. Israelis have not bought into it. There are some really good Reform and conservative synagogues around Israel. There's some really good ones. But there's a lot of them that nobody goes to, or that aren't doing so much. And it's a problem. But I will tell you this, the Reform and the conservative movement in Israel are very united. They're almost the same thing. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. We're coming up on the World Zionist Congress elections. So I'm on the plank of the Reform movement. We're running for our position. And World Zionist Congress is no joke. They control over $1 billion. And whoever, the more votes you get, the more money you get for your institutions. And I'm not the, I don't know how well our movements are doing. But what I'm really afraid of is the Orthodox limiting our rights. And so it's really important that, if I convert someone, that Israel considers them Jewish. If someone gets married here, and then they go to Israel, they say, well, you're married, you weren't married by a Reform, you were married by a Reform rabbi, it doesn't count. All that stuff is nonsense. The discrimination against women, discrimination against LGBT, all that stuff we need to deal with. So I'm running as part of the platform. But I'm not running as part of the Reform platform. The Reform and Conservative are one movement. So I'm running as the Reform and Conservative together. So vote for me. Voting starts March 10th. You don't vote for me, you vote for the Reform/Conservative movement. And hopefully we'll get enough votes, and October 20th I'll be in Israel to vote on behalf of the Reform movement and Conservative movement. Let me sum up this way. I think that a lot of the things that defined us as movements between Reform and Conservative and said, okay, you're a Reform Jew because of this, or you're a Conservative Jew because of this, I think a lot of those things are no longer applicable. And I think that the reason that made the Reform movement and the Conservative movement so strong was they had great institutions. We had the JTS, where my grandfather went. We have Hebrew Union College, where I went. You have the URJ. You have the United Synagogue, I think it's called, of the conservative movement. You have the RA, the rabbinic movement of the conservative movement. You have the CCAR and these were all really powerful and great institutions, and they're all weakening. They're all struggling financially. They're all offering less services. They're all having a lot of trouble. And what made us so strong, our institutions are sort of crumbling. Are there some good things that are happening? Sure, but not a lot. And so it's my contention that the needs that we had and what helped build the American Jewish community to one of the greatest Jewish communities the world has ever known is changing in a big way. And I think we're getting to a point now where you're either, if you care about being Jewish, because there's some people who don't care at all and consider themselves nothing, but if you care about being Jewish, you're either Orthodox or you're not. But if you're not, there's not much difference there between us. We're pretty much the same. And so for the need for all these different movements, Reconstructionist, Humanist, Renewal, Reform, Conservative, to me it's all one. And at the same time, we're dividing up all of our resources in all these different places when we could be pooling it together and working together. So I think that we're coming close to an era of post-denominationalists. And if it were up to me, when people say to me, are you a Reform rabbi? To me, that's limiting. I said, no, I'm a rabbi. And by the way, it's not just a synagogue. We have a school, we have a performing arts center. It's not like your synagogue where all you have is mahjong. We've got a whole... all right. But if I had to say who we are, as a non-Orthodox movement. If I could make my own term, this is a working term. But I think that we are not so much a Reformed congregation anymore. We're an egalitarian Zionist congregation, in my opinion. We're a congregation where men and women are treated equal, where women can be rabbis, where men and women sit together, and we're Zionist. And if you don't like it, no problem. But that's who we are. And I think, and so what I'm really saying is, the divisions that now exist between congregations are more based on how we feel about Israel than they are what we eat. You're more likely to eat the same foods between a Reformed Jew and a conservative Jew than you are to necessarily have the same views on Israel. And by the way, we care a lot more about our views on Israel than we do about who's eating what. Oh, I'm invited to Art's house for dinner. I don't know his forks. Where does he buy? Where does he buy his chicken? Who knows? Okay. So I don't know that this is going to be my High Holy Day sermon. A lot's probably going to happen in the world between now and then. But I think that if we're going to advance as a movement and go in the right direction, it's probably time to start getting away from reform and conservative and trying to bring non-Orthodox Jews more together based around the things that are important to us, rather than the things that were important to Jews 100 years ago that no longer matter. And at the same time, so let me end with this. Now, I'm someone who is I'm a pretty liberal guy, except on Israel, except on anti-Semitism. Then I'm more to the right. But if you look at the Reform rabbinate today, if you went to one of our conferences where we go to commiserate, about what it's like to be a rabbi. So when we go to our conferences and you see us praying together, almost everyone has a yarmulke. Almost everyone has a talis. Lots of people are wearing tefillin. When I became a rabbi in 2002, when I was in rabbinic school, if you walked into our chapel at the rabbinic school during the day, you would barely see any yarmulkes. You would barely see any talises. You would not see any tefillin. None. We're more ritual observant now than we've ever been as a Reform movement. But at the same time, politically, we're further to the left than we've ever been. It's a bizarre thing to see a rabbi wrapping tefillin and then spouting anti-Zionist stuff. It was like, who are you? Right.
What's the rationale?
So I think that what is their rationale? I honestly don't know. It's just the trend. So let me say it this way. When I was living in Israel, my first year of rabbinic school, I had a friend who started wearing a yarmulke. Why? Because we were living in Jerusalem. And everyone wears a yarmulke in Jerusalem. We want to fit in. Okay, fine. I have no problem. You want to feel more Jewish? Great. Go ahead. As soon as we moved to Cincinnati, where's the yarmulke? Well, I tried it. Well, it's not so easy here. Okay. By the way, that guy, he does wear yarmulke everywhere now. So I'll give him credit for that. But, it was kind of weird. It's just the trend. It's just the trend. I don't really have a better answer. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but it's where politically, well, I will tell you this. Politically, the newer rabbis have grown up in such a polarized world. And they tend to be liberal to begin with, that they fall on that side of the. But at the same time, the Reform movement has embraced more traditionalism in terms of practice, and so it just is where the movement is. But it's weird. It's weird to see someone who's spouting off such such far left-wing political ideology, and then, becoming more and more ritually traditional. It's just weird, but that's what's happening. So, okay, questions, comments? Pamela.
It's so important that we bond together in this non-denominational world because we're dealing with all the anti-Semitism, we're dealing with all the violence, and I'm sure I feel like we as Jews have, and we need to be proactive about all of this. And the way we can be proactive about facing the world that's coming is to bond together and to build a world together.
If I had my way, she said we need to have a plan, and we seem to be rudderless. Having the conservative service here, to me, is like the greatest thing in the world. I wish more people went to it. If it were up to me, we'd have an Orthodox service too, in a different building. Because then I need another building, and then I can get someone to pay. No. But that could never happen. Not because of us. I would invite it tomorrow. If I could say that this is a campus where all Jews are welcome to be Jewish together, what a novel idea. Wait a minute. We could all be Jewish? We could be the same Jewish community? Because now everyone's like, ugh. But, here's one of my favorite lines. And Orthodox Jews, they don't have, Orthodox rabbis don't have a good sense of humor about this. But we had an APAC event here once. And APAC brought the food, because the food has to be kosher. So they brought it in there from their caterer. And there was an Orthodox rabbi here, and it was uncovered, and everything was kosher. And he goes to eat it. And I walk over to him, and I said, it was right here in the social hall. I said, I wouldn't eat it, but it looks okay. You can have. He didn't think it was funny. All right. Any final comments? Aaron, I'll give you the last word.
In New York, where there are lots of conservative Jews, the running joke is that a conservative Jew is someone who brings pork lo mein into their house and eats it on paper plates.
Yeah.
Finish the rest of what he said.
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah. In New York, the joke is that a conservative Jew is someone who brings pork lo mein into their house and eats it on paper plates.
There was a terrible joke. What was it? This is totally politically incorrect. So if you heard it from Aaron, but I think it was something like, no, I can't even tell. It's so bad. I can't even tell it. I'll tell you another time. Well, just take a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up.
One question, that's the overriding question.
Yes.
We've talked about everything that separates us. Some people eat this, some people eat that, some people wear this, some people wear that, some people do all kinds of things that separate us and divide. It is the one concept that unites all Jews throughout the whole world.
DNA.
We're
I'd love for you to address that on the High Holy Day.
It's very simple.
Go ahead.
We're family.
In what way?
You're related.
We're family.
Exactly right.
We're family.
Explain that concept so
Yeah.
we can all grasp it.
I mean, okay, let me tell you something. My son came home yesterday with a series of questions from his English class, he was supposed to interview his parents. And the whole class had it. And, okay, first question, what is the meaning of life? So I said, your teacher ran into the wrong, and I said, listen, before we address that, let's first compare the Buberian versus Rosenzweig approach. And I thought bringing God's will into this world and tikkun olam and oh my God, I was like, your teacher's going to have, but at a very basic level, all Jews have the same covenant with God, and the deal is the one and only God will be our God if we make an effort to fulfill God's will in this world. Now, the problem is we have diverged over how best to fulfill God's will in this world. But we're the same family that has the same goal, and we're family.
But we now have a new divisor, which is Zionism. When you said there are some rabbis that are not Zionists, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. None. They don't understand what Zionism is, but how in the heck can you say that there are rabbis that are anti-Zionist? Does that mean that they're pro-Arabs, pro-Hamas? What do you mean by anti-Zionist?
Well, so
Anti-Zionist. What rabbis do things that are anti-Zionist?
Oh.
Do they say Israel shouldn't exist? Is that what they say?
Well,
Do rabbis say that?
there is such a thing. Yeah, yeah. I'll show you. I'll show you. But let's take a few more questions. But I will show you.
My husband is 99.9% Jewish, right? Ashkenazi.
Okay.
I think it's a race. That's the only reason I even pay attention. It's a race. The Jews are generally a race.
No.
Except the Sephardics.
But there's black Jews.
It doesn't matter. We're all Jews, right? I converted.
Hitler said we're a race. We don't like that.
We're all Jews. The point is, that I believe it's a race.
Well, that's what Hitler said. So we don't love that.
My husband, I mean, he's not any less Jew than the Orthodox Jew because it's his bloodline.
Right. But you could be any race and be Jewish.
I know, but it's not the same. You're 99%, 0.9 Ashkenazi Jew. It's a race of some sort. It's not a race. It's just,
Okay. Okay. More questions.
What she's saying.
Yeah.
Judaism is kind of, to me, unique and impossible to fully comprehend, tease out, because it's a combination of ethnicity.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all.
It's a combination of ethnicity and ethnic group
Yeah.
and religion.
Yeah.
You can convert and join the religion, but you're still not in the ethnic group, and you can become an atheist, and you're still in the ethnic group, even though you have no use for the religion.
Right. So let me just.
Very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a different conversation, but let me just end with this. My goal today was to try to frame how the reform and the conservative movement came about in America, why they became the movements that they did. And by the way, their success is what led to the tremendous American Jewish community that we have today. But I'm trying to ask the question, are the reasons that the reform and conservative movement, the reasons that they were founded 100 years ago, do those reasons still hold water? Or is it time to reconstitute into a new movement that might better serve our people? And that's the question that I'm grappling with. So we got to hang on one second. I want to thank you all very much. I'll stick around for a minute if you have more questions, but thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. You look like